Welcome, Kristy Houle, to Coaching a Session. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for coming on. So I have you on today as an educational outreach coordinator and author. And what you do with homeschooling, helping parents understand the difference between the two is so important, especially now. Without me kind of telling you your whole biography to the whole world, in your own words, can you please tell people what you do and how you help the world?
Sure. So I, sort of went into homeschooling in somewhat of a non-traditional way. I started my career 20 plus, we won't get into numbers or age, but I started my career a really, really long time ago as an elementary school teacher in a large district in St. Louis. And that's what I wanted to do my whole life. Wanted to be a teacher. I've always been a teacher at heart. And so I taught grade school for almost 10 years. And then from there, I went into administration roles. I was building principal for 10 years at another large district in St. Louis. And I was really on my way to hopefully being superintendent, being in central office, because that's really where my heart was public education and just educating children in general. I have 3 children of my own. And around about the time when I was getting ready to finish my doctorate degree in 2015, my youngest son was diagnosed with language developmental delays in language and speech. He was too young at that time for an actual diagnosis of autism, which he did receive later. But we knew that what he was struggling with in the public school was not helping him thrive in that setting. And so coupled with that and some family loss that was very close to us that we didn't expect, I made a very, very quick transition within about a month to on the fast track to being a superintendent to being a stay-at-home homeschool mom of 2 kids at that time. And then my oldest came to be homeschooled later. So yeah, I went from public education to homeschool education very, very quickly. And then about 6 years into homeschooling, I started doing the educational outreach coordinating for a company, an organization based in St. Louis, Educate.today. And what we do is we provide online resources for K through 12 students and teachers in the St. Louis area and across the nation. So that's sort of in a nutshell where I've been, what I'm doing, some of the experiences I've had. I don't know how that's impacting the world. I hope that it's at least impacting those around me and the students and teachers and families that I have come into contact with over the last definitely 6, 7 years as a homeschool mom, but also just in my journey as an educator.
And I do want to reaffirm what you do does make an impact, whether it be the book you write or just the people you have as clients or people you work with, the people you talk with, the people who listen to your podcast. All of those different things are going to compound to you helping the world. And I don't want you to belittle that, right? Because it is so profound what you do. And right now, we're living in a society where many parents are switching from public schools to homeschools if they can't afford private schools. So they're doing the job themselves. And they kind of got thrown into it in 2020 with the pandemic and the quarantine. So they didn't necessarily want to homeschool their kids, but they were kind of given that hand. Well, good luck, right? And then they were given Zoom calls and then they were given packets, and parents had to figure out how to be teachers. And parents had a good understanding during that year. Teachers are so important, where it's not just, okay, I'm sending them to a glorified babysitter. Teachers are more than that. Teachers go in, they slave, not just during the school day, but after with lesson plans, prepping. There's so much more than the school day and summer vacation. Teachers are always thinking about your kids, trying to figure out ways that they can make learning fun, engaging, and also impactful on that child. So we get into that aspect, but there's something happening in our world right now. Society's kind of very free is the word I'm going to use, very free with their values and their belief system. So anyone can be a certain way. Boys can be girls, girls can be boys, that type of thinking, right? And some teachers forget that their job is teaching. So they say, well, my opinion is this, whether it be political or be cultural. They say, this is my opinion, and they almost introduce it in a way where it's kind of like, hey, I accept this. You should accept it too. Not saying you have to do it or I'm not going to like you, that type of forceful way. And parents are seeing that. So now parents are like, well, I don't want my kids in public schools, so I'm going to homeschool. But homeschooling is not as easy as saying, well, I'm going to homeschool and it happens. Can we go down that path a little bit?
Yeah, of course. So all really good points that you just brought up. And yeah, and as I was listening, I know that every family dynamic is different and every situation is different. And, me, for example, when I decided to make the transition from being an educator, and this is someone who has a bachelor's degree in education, a master's degree in education, a specialist degree in education with the superintendent's endorsement, I was fully equipped on paper to be the perfect homeschool mom. But what I realized when I made that transition was it was not what I thought it was going to be. And there were many, many areas in homeschooling that I really lacked in, that I didn't even know that I had to learn as I was homeschooling my children. And so, with me as an educator, one of the main things, and I think this is where we get into some of the points that you brought up about the values and beliefs and some of the roles that the teachers are taking on with students these days that maybe parents are opposed to, is we always are pushing relationships. That's one of the most important things that you can have with a student, or your child, right? Whether it's the kids in your classroom, the students in your school, your children at home on a homeschool level. And I think sometimes we've pushed that to the point where teachers do feel comfortable enough that they can say or do anything or introduce things into the classroom setting that really aren't appropriate for that setting. And that's the way that a lot of families have seen it. You talk a little bit about the pandemic, and I do think that was a catalyst, and it went two ways. It went one way where folks were like, okay, I get it. I really respect teachers so much more now. And I understand how difficult their job is. I didn't get it before. I can't wait to get my kids back into a school setting so that I can go back to life. But then I believe it was also a catalyst, as you said, for parents to say, I can do this. I can educate my children at home, and I can control what comes in to my child's characters and what comes in to their learning and what is introduced to them. I do have more control, and I did get over the hump of being able to do that logistically and schedule my life around it. So we want to keep it this way. We've seen a mass exodus of students leaving public education to be in a homeschool environment. And I think part of that is to what you're saying. Yes, there are a lot of things being talked about in school these days that, you can go way back. There was a time when we were fighting over prayer not being allowed in school, right? And now we're fighting for things that we don't want in school to be out, but things just keep coming in and coming in and coming in. And it's really not the teacher's place to bring a lot of those things in. So, unfortunately, I do think that is a big reason. But, I think that the academics and the achievement gaps that we're seeing in children, these kids are coming out of high school and they're not equipped for the society that's waiting for them educationally. There's so many children that are coming out of high school that can't even tell you how many continents there are, that can't tell you what countries border the United States, that can't tell you when, we fought the Civil War or for civil rights. And so I think we're pushing a lot of things into the school system that maybe aren't as important or really isn't the place for children. And we're forgetting to really educate them along the way.
When I was finishing up my years of teaching, because I'm a former educator also, I saw a lot of standardized testing, a lot of assessments, things like that. Nothing wrong with assessments to figuring out where they are to help them get to where they want to be. But just seeing a first grader just so stressed out, just like, wow, like they're first graders, right? They want to dance, they want to be free, and they're told to be quiet for 7 hours and literally have a test. And just seeing them, like, because I did music. So they would come in and you would just see them just like drained, like their soul was gone. And I was just thinking, I was like, there has to be a better way than, putting them through this type of testing. And we had some standardized testing and we had some assessments growing up, but it wasn't to this degree where it is today. It has ramped up over the years. I would say in the past 20 years, it really has ramped up on how much we test our children. It could be a funding thing, right? Like if they produce, then it's like, okay, they can get funding, or it could be, okay, we need to get some data so we can figure out what they need. But it always seems like they get this data and then they just adjust to where the kids are. So for example, CDC came out, I believe early this year, where they dropped the childhood developmental standards. Maybe not a big deal to some people, right? But for me, my parent brain, my teacher brain is thinking, is like, why can't we get back to that standard of where we had expectations, where we had guidelines, where we followed the curriculum and we held everyone to that high standard? Now it's kind of like, well, everyone gets a trophy, everyone is going to do good. And then, yes, when they do graduate from high school, they're not equipped to handle the adult world. And that was one of the factors that caused me to leave teaching and then start my coaching business, because I do youth mentoring for young minds. So I am going to be working with kids that are either in high school or exiting high school, and then some college, where we're talking about, well, let's figure out what direction we need to go in. And then once I get a good understanding of what they would like to accomplish, then I give them the skills that they need that they didn't get from their school, from the parent, whatever it be. But I want them to be equipped, because what I saw in the school system was people growing up, and as they were growing and going up in the ages, they were slowly getting to adulthood, but they weren't getting any more equipped for that job. So that's why many people go out, they don't know anything about finance. They'll go get all these student loans. They don't realize that that money has to be paid back. And now we have a basically epidemic of student loans and everyone trying to get it forgiven, where the responsibility is gone. There's so many things that can be spoke about how we're progressing, and it's leading us to a more fragile society.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. And just listening to you talk, I mean, just first going back to assessments, I, obviously was in the world of giving the state assessments every year and all of the, the hype before the assessment would go out and the rules and the this and the that. And, it kind of was getting to the point where people were losing their jobs over these assessments, and people were, being, instead of working as a team in a school, we were seeing teachers against each other because, the teachers were so worried about getting their classes to score proficient or higher on these assessments. But when you look at the statistics of the graduation rate as compared to the proficiency on these state exams, there's such a large gap where we're graduating everyone, we're passing everyone on to the next grade level, the next grade level, the next grade level, but we can't get our children to pass assessments. And so that just sort of goes to show you that there is a big problem with not only the way that we assess students. I've said this on many, many podcasts, and I will say this all day long. I'm not a proponent of grades. I do not think that the current grading scale is appropriate for children at all. I don't think that giving them A's, B's, C's, D's, and F's are helping them to be successful. I think it's teaching our children to lie and to cheat and to do what they have to do to get the grade, and it means nothing to them. And it's not a true assessment of their mastery of a concept. So I've never been a big proponent of grades for many, many years, but we're still treating the school system as we did when school systems began in the industrial age. Everyone's a cog on a wheel, and you're going to the next grade level regardless of what you've learned or what you haven't learned. And it's up to the child to then try to catch up, And I feel for teachers. I don't want this to be, oh, teachers are doing everything wrong, because they're doing the best they can in a system that has not progressed with the generation of children that we currently have. We're not using appropriate technology in schools, but yet we're assessing them to death with paper and pencil, and their world is technology. And so we just have not quite caught up the system of education. And a lot of that is because we are so financially bound by government and state resources and funding that, it's kind of like the ball and chain. We have to do what we've been told to do in order to get the funds to continue to have kids be able to be in our schools. And so I think folks are just starting to see the light on some of that. Like you said, a lot of kids are coming out not knowing what they want to do or how they can even do it because of the lack of the mentor skills that you're providing for people, the lack of counseling, the lack of classes that actually lend themselves to that career. I have my oldest son just graduated 2 weeks ago, and originally he wanted to go into law enforcement. And he has since changed his mind because of the civil unrest and things that have happened in our country over the last couple of years. He no longer thinks that that's a good career choice for him. But before he made that decision, I mean, he was a senior before he made that decision, and he hadn't been offered one course or done anything in his high school career that lent itself to criminal justice as a career, or like you're talking about, finances, banking, how to keep a budget. So they need to step it up when it comes to giving kids the skills they need for the careers that are of today.
And also, another component of education is parents. Parents have to understand that just sending your kid to school is not some magic formula for them to know everything that they need to know. Parents, you should be educating your children also. Mm-hmm. When I was thinking about having you on, I was like, homeschooling, public schools, and then mixing the two, right? Kind of like getting the best of both worlds, because there's so much good from both. And then there can be some negativities and drawbacks, I guess, from both too. For example, homeschooling, you might not have that peer-to-peer type of interaction for that whole school day, where you would maybe just have clubs where you have soccer practice or football practice. you would get to interact with the peer group, but in school, you get to interact with the peer group all day long. They get that type of development where they're able to interact more with their peers. And that's important too. So I want people to understand you just can't hide your kids away, lock them up in the house, and expect them to come out good, right? They
Yeah.
have to be socialized properly.
Like you said, I think, and I'm sorry, I'm just so, what you just said is so important because we treated our situation per child, per situation. We are not, in our family, we're not a one size fits all. I have 3 children. They're all very different. Their needs are very different. Their abilities are very different. Their personalities are very different. And so when families are making these decisions, you have to look at your child. Right. And so when we started homeschooling, we had my younger 2 children here. And as they grew, and matured and got older. My middle son, who's going to be a freshman in high school this year, around about end of 6th grade, I started to notice that he needed more. He needed the peer groups. He needed the sports. I knew he was an athlete. I knew he enjoyed that. He was in a couple of like football clubs and, the football leagues that you can do as a community and at the Y, but it wasn't a school affiliated. And so when he came to us and said, hey, I really want to think about going back to public school, and luckily we lived in a neighborhood where he had a lot of friends that went to public school. And so I'm sure that was sort of, they were kind of nudging him too, right? Like, oh, dude, you need to come to public school. You need to go to middle school next year. And we didn't look at that as, no, absolutely not. We're only going to homeschool our children because of XYZ. We looked at him as an individual child and said, how is he doing in this environment? What is that going to look like for him in a year? What is his desire? Why does he want to go to school? What are our expectations going to be of him when he's in public school? And so those are a lot of conversations that we had to have with our child and with each other and say, listen, we support you. We want you to thrive. We want you to flourish. And if you think that you're going to be flourishing in this environment and this is really what you need right now, let's try it. And that's the other thing is it's not a permanent decision. I think a lot of times folks get caught up and say, well, if I'm homeschooling then and I want to go back to public school, or if I'm in public school, it's so hard to transition. It's really not. You simply make a phone call and you register your child and they can be sitting in a seat in a public school the next day, or you can call there and say, hey, this isn't working out. I want you to drop my child. He'll be coming home in a week. And then you just go from there. So, it's not a permanent decision, and so we let him try it and said, this is the first year expectations. This is what we need to see. This is how involved we're going to be. This is what we want to hear from you. And it worked for him. He's a great student. He's an athlete. He's played football for 2 years. He's played basketball. He's just went to state for track. He keeps his grades up and he's a great student. And now he's going into high school and hopefully will be successful and play college and whatever, but every child is different. So I want to make sure that parents are looking at both sides. Like you said, there's good and bad about both. And you really have to think about that, the whole picture before you make those decisions.
And kudos to you for seeing your son wanted to go to middle school and then allowing him and not being like a tyrannical parent saying, no, you're going to listen to me, because that's going to create a divide in the relationship, number one. And then kind of going back to what you said earlier, which is the whole premise of the conversation is you're a former educator, education, probably the ins and outs, all the grades, most likely, how to teach. But at the same time, you're like, I'm also sort of equipped to handle homeschool, but then you dive into it. You're like, well, maybe I wasn't so ready. So it's kind of like, yes, we are educators. And then we try homeschooling. Then we realize, okay, there's a lot more that I have to do or learn. And then we, of course, fill in the gaps. And then we move through that process. But your emotional intelligence, and typically teachers have this, a high emotional intelligence where they can see, okay, I'm lacking in this area. What do I need to supplement? Do I need to give them a tutor, a math tutor, for example? Maybe you're not good at math, and then you give him a math tutor or a language tutor, right? So we supplement that type of homeschool learning, where I find oftentimes many homeschool parents, they try to fill everything themselves. They're like, I have to do Spanish, and they're rushing to try to learn everything. And education, going just for one type of education takes years of learning and education. So that now, if you're in the process of learning everything, you're going to be stressed, overwhelmed, and you're going to have to try to keep up, especially if you have multiple children. I know there's a lot of people right now who homeschool that are like educators, former educators, and they're able to come in and do the whole curriculum. Again, you have to have the funds for that, and not every parent has those type of funds right now. So we look at our options, right? We say, okay, well, we can do public school for a little bit until they're a certain grade. We save up and then we can homeschool certain years, especially like the middle school years, because that's kind of, I don't know if you ever worked in middle school, but oh my God,
No, thank
it,
you.
it is a different breed. It is a different breed, those wonderful children.
Yes.
But I mean, you try to shelter them. And if you have boys, not that big of a deal. Girls, middle school, private school, please. But it's a whole thing. And then we get into the different types of schooling, right? We have homeschooling, public, private. I went to private schools growing up. It was K-8. So I kind of skipped that whole middle school type of environment where it was just middle schoolers, where it was everyone, right? And then I noticed in that type of environment where the school was K-8, it was actually better because then the eighth graders saw the kindergartners and they would be like mentors to them, and vice versa, seventh graders, sixth graders, like that. So the middle schoolers had little ones looking up to them, and they were basically, oh, I have to show up, versus I'm sixth, seventh, eighth grade. I got to be cool. I got to be accepted. That environment necessarily wasn't there as forceful. So I know some people are thinking about, they don't have the time to do homeschooling. Maybe they have work. I know many companies now are getting away from working from home. So they're having to go back into the office. So they don't have that luxury anymore to stay home with the kids. So now they have to put them in school, whether it be public or private, because homeschooling is not viable for them anymore.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you think that private school is better than public schools, or we can talk about those differences?
Well, honestly, before I answer that, I want to go back to something else that you said,
Mhm.
especially for anybody that might be listening that is starting out homeschooling maybe next year, or maybe is a teacher that, is thinking about homeschooling. And, you talked a little bit about being able to teach the curriculum and, having all of the necessary materials and ready to dive in. And I think, something that I had to learn the hard way, and the biggest hurdle for me, because, when I went to homeschool, first of all, after everyone picked their jaw up off the floor when I made that announcement at my school district, because everyone was thinking, okay, she's on her way going up. Like, she's been working for the last 5 years to try to become a superintendent. And I come, bouncing in one day. Now I'm going to like resign and homeschool. Everyone, around me were, oh, you're going to be great. And, you're going to be like the rock star homeschool mom and all these things. And so I went into it thinking that. But what I realized from day one was that I didn't really know how my kids learned. I didn't know my kids as well as I thought I did, because I was the typical working mother, right? I knew everybody else's kids. I knew all 500 plus kids in my school building, up and down, back and front, how they learned, what their personalities were, if they were a visual learner, an auditory learner, or what they struggled with. But I didn't know that about my own children because I hadn't spent time with them in an educational setting. They came home, I went through their book bag, I signed their forms, I asked them how their day was, we'd sit down and do some homework, and then it was, story time, bath time, off to bed, and repeat the next day. So what I had to learn at the beginning was how each of my children learned, what their interests were, what they were passionate about, if they learned better in the morning or in the afternoon, if they were better at listening to directions or reading directions. So I had to really relearn my children, and that took time. So if there's anybody listening to this that's thinking about homeschooling, don't be in a rush. Take your time, build a relationship with your children. I know that sounds silly, but it's so important. Don't try to just jump in and do things before you even know how your kids learn best, because it really is a lifestyle. So, but once I figured that out, took a long time. It took a lot of tears. And my husband, who works from home as well, would come up and say, "What's going on?" I'd be crying or frustrated or, in the kitchen upset. And the kids just weren't doing the workbook pages that I gave them or whatever. And he's like, "You have literally just replicated the public school system. That's all you've done." And that was what you were trying to get away from. I mean, I had everything from the desks lined up. I had the teacher desk. I had the flag hanging in our schoolroom. I mean, it was schoolroom central. And he said, "It's not working for our kids. That's not how they're going to learn. You have to readjust everything." So yeah, so it was definitely a learning experience. So get to know your kids and get to know how they learn and give it time. Don't be in a rush to, shove curriculum down their throat. So I know that there was another question in there and I got off on a tangent, but public school versus private school, I think, again, like I mentioned, I have one child that just graduated from high school, and I have my middle son who's going into the public high school here. And then my youngest son is actually attending a private school. And again, totally situational. I think that, there are good things and bad things about public versus private. And if you are able to afford a private education, I think, for my younger son who would be in middle school this year, he would be a seventh grader. That was just not an environment that he could handle. And so you knowing school the way you know school and the way kids, he's a very, very quiet child. He is autistic, but he needs very, very little support. That means he basically can do everything for himself. He struggles with schoolwork to be on the same academic level. And so that environment would just be way, way too much for him. And I think he would get very lost. And so, but he also didn't fit in the special education setting of that room either, because a lot of those children in that program, which we did go visit, had more challenging behaviors. And he was not in that, he didn't fit in that group either. So because he was not a good fit for that setting, we did look around for a private school that would fit his needs. And, instead of just, what can fit our needs as far as schedule and money, what would really fit his needs. And we were very, very lucky to find an organization here in town, a private school. They work one-on-one with children. He's got 10 children in his room. Some have IEPs, some don't, but it's a very small group and it's all one-on-one, and they move around with classes. They have PE every day, which again, he needs. He's autistic, so he needs that release of energy. So it was just a really good fit for him. And so it has been interesting having kids homeschooling and having kids in public school and having kids in private school. It's a lot to keep up with, but it's worth it. Definitely.
Yeah. I'm going to touch base on helping parents get to what type of learner their kids are. I have a podcast. I don't remember what episode. I think it's like episode 80 or something, like in the 80s. And I have a whole workshop. It's a whole workshop on it, on how to identify what type of learner your child is. Easy. So check out that. I think it's called identifying what type of learner your child is. And then if on YouTube, it's like parents have to watch this episode, something like that. So that's important to understand, right? So if they're a visual learner, you give them more visual cues. If they're auditory, you give them more auditory directions. If they're kinesthetic, you make learning interactive and fun. Now, from beyond that, right now we go into the realm of special education. So special education, I did it for 2 years after I was out of music and I was transitioning out of education, but I did it for 2 years. I loved it. I love working with those children. They are so smart and they are so wonderful. And everyone who gets this misconception of someone who has autism or who has an IEP in special ed, that they're somehow inferior, which is so far from the truth. If you had an opportunity to sit with them, because I was doing one-on-one with these children and work with them, you will understand how brilliant, how caring, how charismatic they are. They're wonderful people. Yes, they might have outbursts if they're going to be some type of behavioral problems, but even then, for me at least, I was able to appreciate the good and the bad. I understand where they are. If they need some more support, that's my job. I want to support them. I want to help educate them. And for me to be that support system for them, it takes a lot. It does take quite a bit. And I remember one time, this is my first year in special education, where there was a teacher, wonderful teacher. She was on top of her game. And there was just one student. He was super aggressive. And one day he just lost it for some reason. And he just ripped up everything in the room. And I remember after the fact, she was calm during the whole fact, everything. But when everything is said and done, at the end of the day, she had to let loose. So the tears came. And it was all her lesson plans, all the hard work she did. But the next day, she just started over, right? So she rebuilt. Teachers, again, kudos to all the teachers out there, especially ones doing special education, because it does take quite a bit of patience. And parents typically have lower patience levels with their own children. Typically, I'm not saying that that's the case across the board. It's just that as parents, you might tell them more than once or more than one occasion to do something and they don't do it. For example, clean a room. You go back a day later, the room's still not clean, right? Patience level is now going down versus in school, we have the expectations. Make sure we clean your desk, or the desk is being clean, right? We delegated 10 minutes to clean your desk. Desk is clean. It's just different, right? It's just a different dynamic between a teacher and a parent. And then giving a student a teacher who's going to be individual with them is going to be so much more impactful for that child And then especially taking them out of a negative environment like middle school. Not saying that all middle schools are bad, but it's just the hormones and the emotions are so haywire. It makes for learning and peer engagement very interesting. It's a word I'm going to use, interesting. And so, like, if you have a student who needs that extra care, they're going to be outcasted. They're going to be ridiculed in your typical public school, middle school. I hate to say that, but that's what's going to happen. It's because they're looking for peer acceptance and they don't care who they put down. If they can make themselves feel a little bit better, because that's where their mind is at that time in their life, they don't care who they hurt. So even though they might be sweet kids at home, at school, if they see someone who is maybe in special education or something like that, they might look down on them to some degree. And I mean, it just depends on the upbringing, I think, more so than the kid itself, and then maybe a little bit about the peer group. So if he's hanging around kids who always make fun of kids like that, then of course they might kind of jump on the bandwagon. But then at the same time, parents, number one, parents, you have to be there to teach your kids how to be caring, loving, compassionate, all of those things that help them later on in life. And you think that, you being there for them, being caring, being understanding, they don't pay attention. They do. Everything you do, they pay attention to. So if you're on your phone and you say, I'm busy, not now, they paid attention to that. Because when you do want them to come talk to you, they're going to have that same idea in their head. I'm busy, not now.
Yeah. No, and that's a really good point, and when I was my youngest son, who's now in private school, my son that's autistic, I knew we were getting to the point where he needed something more because we were starting to have the mother-son, butting of the heads at home during homeschool. And I started to notice that because he was getting older. And it was, exactly what you said, like I would have to ask him 3 or 4 times to, let's finish working on this project. And he had so many distractions at home. He could be outside on the play set, or he could be, playing a video game, or he would be wanting to take a break. And so our relationship started to suffer because I was not only mom at night, and on the weekends, but I was also the teacher during the day. And I was constantly having to argue with him, bicker with him, sort of nag him about getting this work done. And it was not lending itself to a very cohesive relationship as he grew. And so that was another reason why we started to look into a private school for him, because I knew that he needed more than what I was capable of giving him. He needed a new environment. He needed more peer relationships that were positive. And sometimes, and you mentioned this a little bit earlier, you can't do it all. I always was looking for extra resources. I was always looking for extra help. I was always reading books, reaching out to community organizations, getting on mom groups of forums of parents that were dealing with some of the same things, asking for help. None of us can do everything good all the time. And so just being open-minded about trying to help yourself to help your kids, it takes a village. And so even if it's a village of strangers, sometimes we need to lean on each other to do that. But I did ask my 2 older children that had been in attendance at the middle school when I was thinking about putting my youngest there, and they both said, Mom, no, it's not a good environment for him. And they were scared for him to be in that middle school environment and not to really be able to defend himself or to understand what was really happening around him with his peers. To your point, yes, it's not always the most conducive place. But, I had no idea how to learn and how to help my child that with special needs. But just watching him and being open-minded and being flexible and willing to change what I did yesterday immediately when it wasn't working for him, that had to just be okay with me. Sometimes the lesson plans just go out the window and you just have to say, listen, we're going to start over
Mm-hmm.
and I forget all these lesson plans that I just spent, 20 hours making. What do you need? What do you want to learn? You pick something that interests you. Let's do that today.
Yeah, I remember one time I was I forget what grade it was, elementary though, where I had my lesson plans. I was like, all right, we know exactly what we're going to do. I have all these new songs we're going to do, all this, right? Out the window. I was like, all right. It was like one thing after another. They weren't working. I knew how to get them though. So it took a lot more energy, but I was like, I'm going to get them regardless. So I finally was able to do it, but it was like everything that I planned. Every other class did well. It's just this one class was just not having it. I think it was a kindergarten class. So I had to understand, okay, this is not working, scrap it. Let's go to where they are. What do they need right now? And they needed high energy, no space for thinking, where it had to be safe still, because otherwise it'll be chaos. So education is more than just getting a packet, reading a book, and then relaying that information to someone. Education is so much more. And I talked a little bit about emotional intelligence, understanding that person, understanding that student, that child. You have to be able to understand them and see where they are. Like if you look at their face, are they stressed? What are we going to do? Because if they're stressed, most likely they're not going to be listening at that moment, right? So how can we lower that stress level? How can we bring them back so where now their mind can be engaged and learn effectively versus kind of like passively, like I'm listening to you, but I'm not really caring. That is a skill that many people sometimes take years to attain to get to that level of education. Because if you look at a new teacher, they might be efficient, they might be good, they might be loving and caring. But if you look at a veteran teacher, sometimes you can tell a big difference. Not saying that all beginner teachers are bad, because for me, I was adequate. I'm not going to like put myself on a pedestal or give myself a trophy. I'm just going to say I'm adequate. In my district, from where I was day one versus teachers who have been there 20 years, I was more effective than they were because they were in old school ways where they were just doing what they were doing, but they weren't looking at the kids. Me, I looked at the kids. I was like, what do they need? And then how can I relate that to the curriculum? Because then I was speaking their language per se. And then it has made teaching and the management of the classroom a lot more easy. So paying attention to them. And then also, your boys seeing firsthand going into middle school saying it's not going to be good for their younger brother. They're saying, no. Like, I think it'll be better to put them in a different place because they see that. And if you ever taught middle school, or if you know about the horror stories in middle school, then you're going to be wary, especially if your kid is not going to be able to fit into that type of environment. There's so much to education more than just the book and the assessments and the curriculum. It requires a mindfulness to be there, to understand the kid and to understand your situation. But what I want from you is to give us a few last words. Of course, you can talk about anything I said, or if you wanted to promote anything that you have, a book, whatever, talk about that. And then, of course, please tell people where they can find you.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think just last words are when, we're talking about homeschooling versus public school versus private school. Every educational setting has wonderful things happening in it, and every educational setting might have its challenges. But I think if we continue to focus on student and child success, teaching to the whole child, and sort of sometimes the adults just need to get out of the way and let the children learn and how they're going to learn, and that we all sort of come together, whether you're a homeschool parent, a public school teacher, or a private school teacher. I think that we all have the same goal, which is to raise this generation of children up to be able to be successful citizens of this country, and just to continue to make it, a wonderful place to be, and just to be successful and have impact on others in their lives as they grow. And so that's sort of just final thoughts. And don't be scared to dive into any setting. Learn about it, learn about your child, and just figure out what is right for them. That's the most important thing. So you can find me. I actually did just publish. I'm in the process of writing a series of books. And the first book was just published on Mother's Day, and it is called Quigley's Questions. And it is a delightful story of an inquisitive young man who absolutely drives his family in the first book absolutely bonkers with all of his incessant crazy questions, and sort of how they handle that situation and how he feels at the end of that story. And so you can find that book on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, wherever you get your favorite books for your children. You can also find me at KristyHouleAuthor.com. is a website where you can get in touch with me, reach out to me. I love to talk to people about anything that might be on their mind, help them. I also do school visits for author reads, and just come and talk to teachers about different things. You can also find my podcast, the Classroom Matters podcast, on the educate.today website. Or you can also just search for the Classroom Matters podcast, and you'll find a lot of really cool educational topics on there as well.
Perfect. And congratulations on your book. I know how much work and effort it takes to publish a book, and then to continue writing more books too on that. And then, of course, being a mother, a lot of work. So kudos to you for that. Of course, all the links that you just shared with me are going to be in the description box below. So anyone can easily find your podcast, find your book, find your website, and then of course reach out to you, especially if they're a parent and they're trying to figure out and navigate through the realm of maybe going from public school to homeschooling, or just saying, I want to be better equipped to handle homeschooling. Do you have any advice or tips? And then they can kind of reach out to you and then go from there. But I would like to thank you so much, Kristy Houle, for coming on Coaching in Session. A huge pleasure.
Thank you so much. It was really fun to be here, and it was a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for all the work that you're doing in your journey as well.